Humdrummity, humdrummity, humdrummity.
Hello, listener. Do you ever get so mad you could punch a hole in the sky? Or are you someone whose gaze burns holes through those around you for days? Hey, we all deal with anger in different ways. Luckily for us, today's guest is going to discuss anger and how we can better cope with it, as well as give some advice on how anger can actually help us be assertive and move us to be happier people. Tune in and find out why parents and family can so easily push our buttons. Okay, so before I outrage you with my ramblings, let's get started. Oh, hey, Alistair. Welcome to Humdrummity. How are you feeling today?
I'm pretty good, Graham. I'm feeling good. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me into the space.
Well, that's terrific. It's always good to have a happy guest. So, as is the norm here on Humdrummity, I would like you to start by stating your full given name.
Alistair Victor Moes.
There you go. Now, for the listeners, Alistair's last name is actually spelled Moes, but you pronounce
Correct.
it how?
Moose, like the animal, the hair product, the dessert.
So I'm sure it's one of those names that if you had $1 for every time you had to correct somebody, you'd be a very rich man, I'm sure.
Got to maintain the mystery.
So, as you are actually my first SME on this podcast, and for those who aren't initiated, SME is a subject matter expert. But can you please tell our listeners what your current job title is and what it is that you do?
Well, I have owned and run Moose Anger Management for almost 30 years in next month. And I usually go by either founder or just anger management counselor. And there's 10 of us. And yeah, I run groups, and we have 8 contractors that work with us. So I supervise most of them. My partner runs the women's anger management side of things. And I see lots of people individually all over the world, and run trauma groups downtown Vancouver in person fairly regularly. But all the anger management groups are online, and literally we have people in other continents join the anger management group depending on their time,
Time zones.
where
Wow.
they are. Yeah.
Worldwide. I mean, yeah, that's the magic of technology today that you can
Yeah.
actually achieve those kind of things.
It makes it sound like it's this huge organization, but most of all the contractors are part-time. This is not their only work. And I do social media for the men's side of things, and try not to do too much admin. And I really put effort into minimizing paperwork.
Yes, I hear
So
you on that. I hear you on that. So I find that quite interesting. And maybe on a later episode, I could have your partner on to discuss women's anger. As you specialize in men's anger, I do think that through our discussion today,
yeah.
that what you say will probably be useful to both men and women.
And
Uh,
I also co-facilitated the women's groups for many years,
okay,
and I've worked with lots of women individually, and do currently.
okay. Well,
So I certainly, like, one of the things I usually say on that matter is when we were growing up as boys, we learned not to be emotional, not to show emotion, except for anger was okay. Like on the
mm,
playground, being aggressive wasn't seen as a bad thing. It could actually serve you. Um, so men are only really allowed to show anger and not all the other stuff. No vulnerability, right?
mhm,
Especially the older you get. But women are allowed to show the other emotions, but not anger.
mm.
And when anger is repressed, it has a negative impact on our immune system.
Now, I do want to get into that a little bit more. You're getting ahead of my script here. One thing I did want to bring up, which I find is very clever. What is your practice tagline?
Lose your temper.
Lose your temper. I love that. I love a good double entendre. Good double
Yeah.
entendre always gets me.
We have had some people respond poorly to it, that they don't understand it and they get upset by it. But when I first saw that, I thought, what? And then, I thought about it for a moment and went, oh, that's actually pretty clever. Because
I think,
I didn't come up with that. Somebody else came up with
well, it's good that you can admit that. You're big enough to admit that.
it.
Now, before we get into what I think is, a fairly serious topic for most of us, what I'd like to ask you is like, just to set a good tone here, is like, did anything interesting, odd, or funny happen to you recently?
Well, one of the funny stories that, which isn't really that recent, but I think people appreciate it. I had an 18-year-old was sent to me by his parents. And I usually tell parents, you should probably come and see me yourself. But, anyhow, I'll work with the 18-year-old who it turns out had been basically had very little experience hearing the word no.
Mm,
Came from a wealthy family and they just gave him everything he asked for. And he turned into a bully. Didn't take it very well when people said no.
mm.
So I do a session with him and we schedule another one in and he calls me up at the last minute and says, "Hey, I can't make it today." And I said, "Well, no problem. I mean, your dad will have to pay for it because we have a 24-hour, no-show policy. Somebody
Mhm.
doesn't show up, they have to pay for the session because we can't fill it." And the guy completely loses it on me. And I'm like, kind of holding the phone like a foot away from my ear. And I say, "You do realize you're yelling at your anger management counselor?"
He's
And
proving the point.
he did not respond to that very well. He didn't see the humor at all. But I thought it was hysterically funny. Now, I didn't laugh in the moment, but and I maybe at some point later in life he'll reflect upon this. I don't know.
Yeah, one hopes as we get older, we become self-aware enough to be able to laugh at our foibles, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
that's it's important for us to be curious um, and uh, and try to hold back the judgment when we
Mm,
look at our failings because one of the guarantees is that we're going to continue to make mistakes throughout life. You're going to say the wrong thing, you're going to hurt the people you love, um, among other mistakes. And the challenge is what do we do with those mistakes afterwards? Because if we face them, if we own our part in them, then we can learn from them and make new and different mistakes. Whereas
mm.
most of us make the same mistakes sometimes for decades, sometimes for a whole lifetime. Um, but if we learn from them, then I just think life is more interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you bring that up because I know, and I'm sure many people do this, but I'm lying in bed at night trying to fall asleep, and some random thought from my past will pop into my head, and I'll just be like, why did I do that? Like, what, and I ruminate on it too much, right? And I'm just like, and I can't get past it. I'm just like, why did I do that? But
Yeah.
like, where's the lesson I could, take from that to move past it so I'm not just going through a cycle of, thinking about it, thinking about it, and not moving, say, on from that incident.
So we all have an inner critic, this negative internal voice that beats us up. And often we get that inner critic because, our parents had often the same, or at least one of the parents had the same negative spin. And often people that come to me grew up in families where there was a lot of negativity or
Mm,
criticism. And so understanding, like being curious with that, because it's like, okay, well, why did I do that? Is also like, how did that make sense to me in the moment? And often it's because we didn't really stop and think it through. We reacted. It's like
mm,
it was our default. Often there was stress. Like when people call up, when they phone us, generally they haven't been sleeping well. There's been some big blow up and they've done something that they're feeling ashamed of, and they're doing that same thing where they're thinking these things through and they're repeating it. And if we can actually understand what the background is, it actually makes sense how we ended up doing that. But
Mm.
then we can understand the part of us that reacted like that, which generally is a younger part of us,
Hmm.
right? If we embody the adult and access our intelligence and our heart and all, the experience we have in life, then we tend to act with more wisdom and more maturity.
Right.
But generally, people come to see us because they said or done something where they reacted, and it's like the more we escalate, the more tension and stress, and the more we're like heading into fight or flight, which can happen like in the blink of an eye. Um, the more our emotional maturity drops. So when we're really stressed, having an argument with our partner, or whatever the event is, the more tension that fills our body, the more our emotional maturity level tends in general to drop down into single digits, and then we act like a big baby, and there you go. So if we can understand that, and often there's even history that goes back generations that's
Mm.
related to this stuff,
Interesting.
and the more we can be aware of that, like in my family, my dad grew up in Holland during the Second World War. He was between the ages of 7 and 12,
Hmm.
and the Nazis rolled over Holland in about 5 days. And his dad, who was an officer in the military, ended up being a prisoner of war
Oh my.
for the duration of the war. So
Yeah.
his dad was taken away, you know, and then afterwards, just nobody ever talks about it because
Oh,
that's
they
the
just they
history.
just
And
swept it under the carpet.
they just sweep it under the carpet, and it's almost like there's so much trauma that they just have to practically move forward and do the things that need to be done. And so his dad, not very demonstrative,
Mm.
very, like, he kept every letter that anybody ever wrote him and had
Mm.
everything filed perfectly. You needed to make an appointment to meet, to visit him, and,
Like
and
what? Even his family? Like it's like, hey,
oh
Dad,
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
want
oh
you to
yeah,
say,
yeah,
oh,
yeah. No, nobody's going to show up unannounced.
would he
And
charge a 24-hour cancellation fee by any chance?
possibly. And so then my dad, ends up just not showing a lot of emotion, and
Mm.
acting as if the emotions are irrelevant.
Right.
And my Dutch grandfather, my opa, if he and he wrote a short autobiography, that if he felt all crazy inside, just act normal. That was the instruction.
Don't let it
And
out.
that probably served him well when he was imprisoned by the Nazis, or
Mm.
in business. That probably could serve him well. But it meant that his sons, because I ended up with these letters, ended up feeling like he didn't really care
Mm.
about them. He didn't show the love wasn't moving. And
Yeah.
then my dad was acting, mostly the same way toward me. And
Yeah.
then I started acting that way towards my kids, but I caught myself and I'm like, oh, that's
At
not
what
me.
age was that? Like, was this
Oh, when they
before you
were
became an anger management counselor, or even
oh
after you
no, no,
become a
during.
counselor?
Oh, after
During.
for sure. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And so I became more aware of how this can be passed down to future generations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so so our job is to become aware of it, to become aware of what's behind that inner critic, that negative
Right.
story we carry. It's like, because most people will just try and shove it away. They
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
They're like, get rid of this. But what we need to do is turn toward it and investigate it
Right.
with curiosity. And it's like, okay, how come I'm spinning my wheels and keep on having this? Well, there's there's reasons.
Right.
Oh, my mom acted this way, or my dad acted this way.
Right.
They did the same things, and I wonder how they. Oh yeah, they that came from my grandparents, who probably got it from their parents, or there was a war and there was a specific trauma there,
Hmm.
or other things that occurred. But
Well,
when we know the stories, It's helpful, not absolutely necessary for healing, but it's helpful to make sense of it.
I'd like to just turn back to one thing you were talking about, and that is our actions. So, having reflections upon how we acted in the past, should guide us in our future. But that was one thing as a child, my parents always would say to me, because I didn't do it a lot, was think before you act, right? Think before you act. But I'd always be like, but I'm just acting. I'm just doing, it's easy to say think before you act, but something happens, I react, and I immediately go into my this is how I am going to deal with this situation. So is it through reflection that we hope that maybe subconsciously, maybe we are directing through purposeful attempts to change our actions, that when in those moments, as you said, those fight or flight moments, when we go into default mode, how can we change that behavior so it becomes more innate?
Well, so it's good to get to know what that default mode is, first of all. Like in the first session in our anger management groups, I go into a lot of the physiology about what happens in our body and our brain as we escalate into fight or flight. And for instance, noticing your breathing. When we get tense, our breathing tends to become more shallow, more restricted. If we're holding enough tension, often we'll even hold our breath unwittingly and briefly in between breaths. And so if we're not aware of this, then people will say, well, it felt like a elephant was stepping on my
Mm,
chest,
right.
or there was some like twisting, constricting in my chest. But most of the time, us men grow up learning to kind of disconnect from our body.
Mm,
So in that first session of the group, I'll talk about how what happens in the chest is often about fear, and the solar plexus is often about powerlessness or power. If we feel powerless, we tend to sort of collapse around the solar plexus. If we feel powerful, we tend to hold ourselves up and lead from the
mm,
solar plexus. Where so shame is often there when we collapse,
right.
and in the stomach, often there's worry and anxiety. In the jaw, people clench the jaw. I have a like mouth guard at night. Um, Anger often is in the jaw, tension, gritting
Mm,
our teeth, just hanging
hmm.
on. So sometimes connected to overwhelm. Or people will feel it in their throat. And when people feel it in the throat, it's because they don't feel heard.
Hmm.
They're speaking, but nobody hears them. And
Hmm.
um, so that often shows up there and in other parts of the body. And the more we escalate, the more the blood vessels leading to the high reasoning part of the brain constrict if we escalate enough, which is why we feel dumber when we're overly stressed, when we're burnt
Mm,
out, because the body thinks we're at the edge of fight or flight and is like preparing, for a wild animal attack, because which served us over, hundreds of thousands of years, depending on
right.
your, vision on that kind of thing. Um, but now it's really rare that we're under physical threat. So, but the body doesn't know the difference between a
Mm,
physical threat or an emotional threat. It just experiences threat, even if it's about finances or relationship or what have you. And it does the same thing. If we escalate enough, then the higher reasoning part of the brain becomes inaccessible to us.
right.
And we're left with a very ancient part of the brain, which literally is fight or flight, life or death,
But
survivalist.
is there a way to sort of unlearn that? Or are we kind of like, well, yeah, anger's always going to be there because, cavemen had anger. So ergo, you have anger.
Well,
What are you going to do about it?
all animals have this response. Our job is to become more aware of what happens when we go down this path. Anger can serve us. Anger can lead us to become more focused and determined. And so anger can help us speak up about a difficult topic with our partner or at with our boss, and we can be wise. We can be thoughtful and intelligent and compassionate
Mm,
and feel the anger. Or the anger rises up and we just react with hostility.
hmm.
And so my instruction is when you notice that, shut your mouth
Mm,
because that's not the time to talk. Open your ears and just be present. Notice
mm.
your breathing and listen to what the other person is saying. Half of conflicts will disappear if we just really give the other person the experience of being seen and heard and valued
Hmm.
and, you know,
Well,
emotional safety.
and also by doing that, you are reducing their likelihood for anger. Because if you are in a situation where you're, say, having an argument and you start getting into it and you start raising your levels, well, what's their response going to be? They're going to start doing that in turn. It just becomes cycle. It just escalates, escalates, escalates.
Right. So your partner says or does something that's clearly like reactive, right? They get all totally defensive when you say something, even though like you didn't mean anything by it. And that's an invitation for you to join them.
Mm,
You don't have to. You can stay connected to the adult part of you, but you have to be aware, ooh, yeah, part of me wants to say this or that.
right.
So one of the things with couples I'll say is if either one of you says you always or you never, just just take a break. Just take at least 5 or 10 minutes because anytime anybody says you always or you never, it's an invitation to say that's not true. And the then
Now, that's interesting. So, yeah, you say like these trigger words. So, take away if you hear a trigger word, particularly in a relationship of you always, you never, that's when hey, something's coming. And this goes back to what I was sort of talking about before, about this think before you act. If you approach your life knowing that in a given day, at any given moment, anger could be present. If you are prepared and knowing that, maybe you have a better fighting chance of not experiencing anger because you're like, okay, I'm aware, you know, the trigger signs, you know, you're being more conscious of your feelings that you're prepared for anger.
so anger and each emotion is data.
Mm,
It's information. Anger is the guardian of our boundaries. So if somebody mistreats us, crosses our boundaries, um, mistreats somebody we love or something that we care about, anger rises up. And it's kind of like our body's saying, pay attention,
mm,
right? And it moves us to act. And our challenge is to pause so that we use the higher reasoning part of our brain in our heart.
mhm,
So this pause is what gives us self-control. It allows us the moment to gain more self-awareness, to practice things that actually help, like compassion and empathy, which doesn't mean that you let somebody walk over you, not at all, but it
mhm,
means that you stay connected to the other person's humanity,
mm,
and you're less likely to lose yours. But anger isn't bad. It's just what do we do with it? We can
mm.
turn it into something bad, or we can do something helpful with it.
Well, and that's actually the crux, as it were, of why I asked Alistair to the show, because listeners may be going right now, well, this is all interesting, Graham, but what does this have to do with breaking monotony and the mundane monotony? And what I'm hoping to do with talking with Alistair is this concept that monotony can lead to dissatisfaction, and when dissatisfaction gets large enough, it leads to anger. And so, with that in mind, uh, how can we reverse engineer this process back to addressing the root cause of our anger, which in many cases could, in fact, be monotony?
Sure. Well, and I was actually thinking this morning about how either we are expanding or we are contracting. We
Mm,
don't just maintain the status quo. If we're maintaining the status quo and we're living our life doing the exact same things over and over and over again, life is contracting,
mm.
right? It's
Yes,
like,
yeah.
so
It's
I
becoming
think it's,
less enjoyment. It's just a less of everything.
yeah, we can continue to grow and learn through our whole life. So I'm 63 and I uh, I go to therapy. I attend breathwork groups.
Mm,
I attend other groups. I attend a men's group because for me, it's important to put myself out there
hmm
and do something that's uncomfortable. Step into the unknown, right? Because otherwise you're just, things are just humdrum, right? And uh, and I want to grow and keep on learning through my whole life.
hmm
And um, anger can move us
hmm
to change things up, where we feel frustrated with ourselves, and it's like, now this is not the life that I want.
hmm
That anger can be healthy as long as we're not blaming anybody else. The anger is healthy if we own it, if we take responsibility. Okay, well, I can blame other people, I can point fingers, but that just
Right.
leaves me a victim. And I'm not a victim. I'm interested. I want to be engaged in life, and so that's what I'm going to do. So I can use that frustration to, you know, like take a course or
hmm
do whatever it is,
Well, that
what
that
have you.
leads to, a couple of different points that I wanted to bring up with you, which one, as you started to address, are there positives to anger? Because I just recently read an article that said that at the very least, the positive you can take away from anger is that it leads to decisions. It makes us, take action. My first episode, I talked about this idea of paralysis through analysis, or as my guest called it, overchoice. And in the modern world that we live in, where there's so many choices for us, that we may make no choices. But if we get to the point of like, okay, I am so fed up with this situation I am in, I am going to do something. I'm just anything.
Well, and we want to think that through, but
hmm
not too much. We don't want to overthink it because then we just get anxious and spin our wheels and we get nowhere. So we have to take a risk. We have to step into the unknown because, and so we need to step into vulnerability.
mm,
We need to open up and do something where it's uncomfortable, whether that's having a difficult conversation with your partner or yourself or your boss or your kids or your parents or whoever it is. It's like we need to address things that need to be addressed. And anger energizes us. It's
hmm
just some people interpret the word anger as a negative emotion. Whereas I think every emotion we can do something negative with it or something positive, something
mm.
constructive or destructive. Anger, well, the destructive side is pretty clear, but we need anger to get off our ass, to start a podcast, to do whatever it is. If somebody comes to me and says, I never get angry, I'm like,
Mm,
I'm sorry, because people are probably walking all over you, and that's that like we need anger on tap,
right.
and sometimes we can uh, use the anger intentionally because somebody's mistreating us. We want to be intentional with the anger and communicate in a way that the other person's going to hear it. So on
Yes.
a construction site, with a brother, I might communicate very differently than a stranger, or depending on the environment.
Yeah.
But anger definitely is something we need.
So that brings up a couple questions that I had for you. Um, First of all, like, and this is going to be a lot to unpack here. So I don't know. Well, let's try and break this down. First of all, like, are there different types of anger, or in essence, is all anger the same? And what I'm talking about in that, because you can be angry that, oh, I'm so mad at, the government's raising my taxes, right? But then there's anger like, you've hurt me. I am, you know, really mad at you.
So the situation makes all the difference in the world.
Mm.
And yeah, so, around politics, well, if you're not, people will get completely outraged, and you can see it online pretty easily. And I post, moose anger management on a lot of social media platforms, and I get people actually responding angrily to something that I write.
Right.
I'm writing about anger management, and I usually use humor. I respond to that, with thanks for that great irony,
Yeah. Well,
right?
that I think that's the problem in this day and age, particularly on any sites that allows comments, is irony is lost on people so much. And even it
Yeah,
happens in texting with people, right? The
yeah.
tone is just not transmitted correctly, and people can take things so much out of context, which then leads to more anger. Now, I did want to get into this a little later, but I think since we brought it up, is, there is a lot of anger in the world today. And a lot of it is politically motivated. Now, one of the things when I started my podcast, I was telling one of my friends, and she said, God, I hope it's not a podcast about politics. So I kind of have made it my rule. I don't want to talk specifically about, what your politics are, things like that. But we can talk about politics in general. And there does seem to be, and it doesn't matter which side of the spectrum you're on at this time, there is a lot of anger in this world that is just getting expressed, and a lot of it online with these very vicious things people will write. Again, doesn't matter what side you're on. What can we do to help address that for people en masse?
Well, I mean, first of all, if we're angry about things that we have absolutely no control over, then we're practicing being powerless,
Mm,
right? So it doesn't serve us to be angry around, what's happening in this part of the world or that part of the world or in this political party. Is there something I can do with this? It's fine to be angry about these things, but it's like, if I'm just spewing the anger out into the world reactively, then it's not good for my emotional or physical or spiritual health.
mm,
It's not good for my relationships around me. If I'm allowing myself to get worked up about these things and get super upset, just like when people are driving, they're upset because other people drive poorly. It's like,
hmm
okay, so this is like a new phenomenon, or and I get pissed off driving too, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's like driving, okay, it's 23 kilometers an hour, like come on, right? But I also catch myself and go, okay, how much does this really matter on a
Right.
scale of 1 to 10? Does it make any difference at all? Well, no. We have control over our response to things.
Mm,
And so if we're aware that we're getting worked up over politics, things that we really have no control over, and if we're not willing to actually get involved in the politics, which, we need people involved,
hmm
if you're not going to do that, then it's important to notice the sensations in your body and become aware of how this impacts your thoughts. Whether it's driving or politics, if we allow ourselves to get really worked up, it's going to leak out into our other relationships. We
mm,
get really angry. It can like affect our own physiology for hours and hours. We can
right.
be more tense. We don't sleep as well. We don't treat the people we love as well. We don't treat ourselves as well. It's exhausting, and it doesn't serve us in any way.
hmm
It makes sense that we have an emotional response to what happens in the world and politics, but what do we do with that? Okay, am I going to be intentional with this, or just let this roll over me, and then I'm out of control?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not the one choosing what to do with my emotions, and the world seems to be changing at an increasing rate. Like, society is
Mm,
changing, and you know all sorts of things are changing all the time. at a faster rate than in history,
Hmm.
seems to me. And so, do we adapt to this? Do we accept, okay, well, this is what's happening. How can I navigate this given that this is happening?
So, when you think about anger, and it's interesting because you talk a lot, obviously, about self. So, like, is generally, even though we may be angry about the environment around us, is anger often like an expression of personal or self dissatisfaction? In the end, is anger really just a selfish emotion?
Anger can be selfish.
Hmm.
If the anger goes down that destructive path, it definitely becomes selfish because we're
Hmm.
going into survival and then it becomes about me, 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 me. And so somebody that acts with very little maturity, somebody that acts like a big baby, it's always about
Hmm.
them. I mean, people use the term narcissist, like there's millions of them out there.
Hmm.
We're all a narcissist when we're 2 years old.
Yeah.
At 2 years old, it's all about me because really, like that's the developmental stage. But most people move through that. There's actually a very tiny percentage of the population that are actually diagnosable as a narcissist. But we all have our moments. If we
Hmm.
get angry enough, it's like we act like a selfish narcissist.
Mm.
But that's not what we have to do with anger. It's what some people do, and the less aware you are, then the more likely you're gonna do that.
When we talk about anger as well, we there's and I was alluding to this somewhat before with about different types of anger. And I guess really what it is it's not necessarily there's different types of anger. Anger is anger, but there's different ways to express it. So, what is the difference, say, between explosive anger and what I would call slow burn anger? Like for instance, when
Sure.
I get angry, I blow my top, right? And I come from a family of yellers, and that's how we would express anger, right? You'd yell about it, but then it was out, it was done, and you kind of moved on, right? Now, for Mrs. Humdrumedy, it's more of an internalized anger, right? It's a slow burn that can last for some
Hmm.
time. So, is there a difference between those two kind of angers? And is there a way that if we don't deal with that anger, if we do keep it bottled up, or we do have it come out, in this massive explosion, you know, is one more healthy than the other? Or is it just
Well,
anger?
well, if anger out all the time, if
Mm,
we're just like reacting really over the top with anger frequently, then we're at a higher risk for heart disease, heart attack, stroke. Whereas if we just hold all the anger in all the time, then we're at higher risk for autoimmune disease or
mm,
cancer. Because when we repress the anger, it has a negative impact on our immune system. Whereas when we express the anger out reactively, and this is, a risk factor, it's not causal. But
mhm,
when then it has an impact on our heart. So what we do with the anger, it has an impact on our facial expression, on our body language, on our sleep, on all sorts of things. And so I think there are different, angers on a continuum.
mhm,
And so, frustration, low level anger. But if that frustration happens over a long period of time, or in a couple, if things don't get resolved, then resentment builds up. And if it's
mhm.
just one thing once in a while, and there's small things, they can be let go of. But if, it's about money or parenting or, things that, relationships with family, etc., it's like if those things aren't resolved, then that resentment builds up.
Mhm.
And if it ends up being a big blow up, then it doesn't get resolved. Even if it does seem to get resolved, it doesn't, because then there's all these hurt feelings afterwards and more resentment
Yeah, the
and
residual damage, the collateral damage of it.
baggage. Yeah.
Mm, yeah, yeah.
And all right, so this is is this the relationship I want? Well, no. Well, then we need to do something about it. And we try to address it. If we don't, then we go and get help. We attend a group, or often we'll have the guy attend the guys group, woman attends the women's group, or you see a therapist, or you start reading books about it, or you talk to a pastor or a wise family friend or whatever it
Hmm.
might be. It's like let's do something with this because we're not resolving things. And
Right.
if things aren't getting resolved, then long term it's just going to build up. And
Now, I just want to tap on something that you said, which I think that may be missing a lot in modern life. But having that person in your life, a mentor, a lot of us no longer, practice a religion. We don't have that person to confide in, to talk to about these things. Obviously we can go to Moose Anger Management and have someone to talk to, but do you notice that in modern life that there is somewhat of this lack of maybe role models or people that we can look to or turn to for help in these situations?
well, I had very little guidance growing up.
Mm.
Some people had a very strict upbringing, which has its own issues. I had, I could have used a little more structure.
Now,
Uh,
who did you turn to when you were
yeah,
younger?
it's like we do need mentors,
Hmm.
and I didn't know that I needed a mentor in my 20s. My mom was the one I was closest with, and she died when I was 18, and
Mm.
my dad
Sorry.
was like a big teenager, and 45 years ago, and so really it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I found people that really inspired me.
Mm.
Whereas sometimes I'll come across somebody who found somebody at 19, or when they were a teenager, or they were just really inspired by their dad or their mom. And so I had to find people that motivated me, or that I could learn from. And so it's like we need to seek these things out if we don't already have them, but we definitely need them. And, like when you're a teenager, if you don't have a guide, then you're learning from people your own age who don't know what the hell they're doing either.
The
And that was
blind leading the
my
blind, as they say.
exactly, that was my experience.
I mean, I think for me, the takeaway is that it's never too late to find a mentor or to talk to someone. And this brings up another point, and it's getting to be less and less in the modern world. But is there still a stigma with people, particularly men, to seek counseling or help with mental or emotional issues?
Definitely, there's less, but there's still a lot of men won't ever go to therapy, or talk to people. Doesn't
Mm.
even have to be therapy, but right, the things that are the hardest to talk about, those things need to be talked about the most. I grew up in a family, as mentioned, that nobody ever talked about any of this stuff,
Mm.
including when my mom died when I was 18. My dad didn't even have a funeral. He just didn't talk about it.
What? I mean, sorry,
And
but that is,
so no, I'm with you. It's like definitely deserves that kind of reaction. And the interesting thing is I knew that was wrong, but I didn't
mm-hmm,
have any guidance to figure out how to grieve or any of these
mm,
things, and neither did he. And
mm-hmm,
all of this not talking about things, and not my dad not having a funeral or anything, led me to a career where I talked with people, mostly men, about things that they don't usually talk about.
mm-hmm.
So it ended up motivating and inspiring me in that direction.
And I think this is true for most people. When we think about our family, our loved ones, do you find in your practice speaking with people, or even, well, it doesn't sound necessarily in your experience, but it is much easier for us to actually get angry or lose our temper with the ones we love? Is that because of familiarity? Is it because there's history there? Like my mom could say, like, because of all the history, like one word to me, and because of all the laden implications of what that meant, right? I would just
Yeah.
go, I would get angry. Is there something there that it's easier to get angrier, or we often get angrier with the ones we love?
Well, there's one quote which is, um, of course they're like really good at pushing your buttons because they installed them in the first place, right? So there's the most
I love
emotion
that.
and
I love that.
the most history, and so we're the most sensitive to the people closest to us in general.
Mm,
That's not always the case, but in general, that's true.
yeah.
And uh, if somebody goes to India and they hang out for 3 years in an ashram and meditate in a cave or whatever, and they seem to really have it together, then the instruction is go home and hang out with your family for a while, see how you're doing.
That's the ultimate test. That's the final exam.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And people go back and they get all their reactions, and like they get back together with family, and all of a sudden people are treating them like they're 12 again.
Hmm.
And, yeah, so there's always more growth, put it that way.
There's always more growth. And with that, would it always be more beneficial, again, with your loved ones, if you can grow together by both
For sure.
looking at anger management?
Yeah, yeah. Looking at anger management, looking at, personal growth. What are you doing so that you're learning more about
Hmm.
how to engage this one beautiful life that you have, right? It's like, well, for me, it's like one of my hobbies is personal growth, attending
Hmm.
more things and doing things that I haven't done before, um, putting myself into uncomfortable positions so that I learn and grow.
Right.
But we don't have to, and like there's lots of different ways that people grow and learn. It isn't like therapy isn't the only way. There's lots of ways.
Yeah. Well, and that brings us full circle back to our discussion about monotony, because
Yes.
not only can you break monotony, right? We don't have to think about, bored. What am I going to do, just to be on board? Think about more. You take the time to look at it and say, well, this is actually a chance to grow. So those two things can easily happen hand in hand. You're going to, by doing something that is going to help you become a better person, just a more interesting person, you are going to break out of your monotony and your routine, but you're going to get some personal growth.
Yes. Yeah. Either we're growing or we're constricting.
Or constricting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that brings us back. So that is how we are going to deconstruct going monotony, dissatisfaction, anger. We're going to work backwards from, take a look at our anger by doing some growth, doing some self analysis, which should hopefully help us be less dissatisfied, which will help us then feel that our life is less monotonous.
Yeah, and for kids, it's good that they have some time to be bored.
Oh yeah, there's definitely times to be bored. Louis
Adults
C.
too.
Adults too, but you know, Louis C.K., who I know sort of got a little canceled for a while there,
Yep.
but had a great thing. And he said that is one of the best things for children to learn is to deal with boredom. That is what life is about, is dealing with boredom. Sitting in the back of a car, as I'm sure you did, I did this when I
Yep.
was a kid, and we'd go on, my dad was just like a maniac driver, like not a bad driver, but he was the kind of guy. We'd go to Jasper, where his family was from, and we would
Nice.
do it in like one go. So that's like a 14-hour drive with just bathroom breaks and stopping at truck stops for dinner.
Hmm.
But you're sitting in the back there, and we didn't have our devices or anything
Yeah.
like that. Maybe we had some Archie comics and
They were called windows,
yeah,
looking
and
out
windows and
the
looking at and contemplating. It gave you a chance to kind of think, or in our
Yeah.
case, piss your brother off beside you and get into fights in the back car and then of the car, and then having to get out and having to walk a mile or a kilometer.
Yeah, well, and that helped you grow and learn about interacting with people.
It did. It did. Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing I know from you is a phrase that you've used, which is, and you alluded to it earlier, which is, you know, in a moment of anger or a moment of, maybe even indecision,
Hmm.
what you would say, what would the older you say to the younger you? What I do on my show is I reverse that. So if the younger Alistair Moes could see the older Alistair Moes, what would his take be on that guy?
He'd be like, "Wow, that's not what I expected." Yeah, yeah. When I was younger, I don't think I really thought about what life would be like in my 60s, but I don't think that it had me, attending breathwork sessions and doing some, kind of pushing the envelope therapeutically and doing things like that. Um, but I think if the younger me was going to give the older me some some advice, it would be make sure you keep having fun.
Don't forget about fun. Yeah.
Make sure you enjoy yourself. Keep being silly and like be your make sure you be yourself in a way that works in your life.
Mm. I think that is a very good piece of advice for everybody. So thank you, younger Alistair Moose. And now I would like to say thank you to the older Alistair Moose for taking the time for joining us here on Humdromedy.
Thank you, Mr. Humdromedy himself. And yeah, thank you for the conversation. I appreciate it.
And I really appreciate your insights, and I hope other people find them helpful as well.
Me too.
Okay.
Me
Take
too.
care. Hey, thanks for listening this far. I first met Alistair in 2014 when I attended one of his group sessions to help me deal with my anger. Everyone, let's not be shy about needing support for emotional or mental issues. If you or someone close to you could use anger management counseling, please visit Moose Anger Management online. For men, go to angerman.online, or for women at healinganger.ca, and learn to lose your temper. Take care.